Anzi Nitutemtek, Kinuiskwe Unitsigasan. My name is Cathy Richardson, and my Cree name is Kinuiskwe, and I'm here tonight on the unceded lands of the Abenaki in southern Quebec. And I'm going to have a conversation with Dr. Allan Wade, one of the co-founders of Response-Based Practice, and Ian Johnsen, who's a therapist in Australia, in Woolongong. And we're going to be talking about questions. What are they? What do they do? What is their therapeutic value? And different approaches and ideas and discourses around questions. So we'll meet them in just one moment. So here I am back with Allan Wade and Ian Johnsen, and I'm just going to invite them to introduce themselves and tell you a little bit about what they do and where they are. Allan, do you want to go first?
Sure. Ian is gratefully, thankfully, a great friend of mine and advisor in certain respects. He's a bibliophile. He reads everything and sends along all kinds of useful information, and a long-term practitioner of solution-focused therapy and other, what would we say, more proficiency-based approaches, if I can put it that way. Has done a lot of work, particularly with young people, for many years. And just really happy that we have an opportunity to be on the call together and to chat about something we both love, which is talking about questions.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Ian, it's your turn.
Thanks for that, Allan. And Allan doesn't really need much by the way of introductions, of course, because I think he's affectionately known by people as the father of response-based practice. And it's been my privilege to know him now for, I think, about 15 years, maybe a little more. Yes, I've been very interested in the what would be loosely called constructivist type therapies. So thinking about how we use questions as tools and to construct conversations with people and create more fully accurate descriptions and meanings. And of course, it's easy to talk fancy about doing the work, and it's hard to do the work simply, which is really where solution-focused practice, I think, is quite helpful. It's kind of radically simple, but actually very hard to do. And there's some real interesting crossovers and similarities between response-based practice and solution-focused practice. So I think they sit quite nicely together, although there are some challenges too. I think if every solution-focused practitioner understood the distinction between effects and responses, that would go a long way to fixing a lot of the problems. But at any rate, and I'm on in Woolongong, which is south of Sydney, on Dharawal country. Traditionally, Wadi clan were the people here. Of course, as we say here, always was, always will be Aboriginal land. It's my great pleasure to join you both here today. I'm very fond of response-based practice, but I'm even more fond of the team, and it's a great pleasure to be here and chat with you. Thank you.
Oh, thanks, buddy. And thank you for the welcome to land territory, the acknowledgement. And I'm presently on the traditional and unceded territory of Coetzel First Nation Coast Salish peoples, on the area also colonially known as Southern Vancouver Island.
Great, thank you for the introductions. There's so much I have been wanting to ask you about. And one of the things that I love so much about studying questions is that there's such an intentionality behind it. And it's so lovely to see practitioners or, therapists, counselors, helpers, using questions as if they know what they're doing, as if they know that they might be helpful. So I wanted to start our conversation by reminding you of the Congress in Milan, probably like 15, 20 years ago, when Gianfranco Cecchine was welcomed out to the mic, and he went out to address the audience, and he took the mic and he said, "Are there any questions?" Which is so lovely, right? And Allan, it was probably you that told me that story, and I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the significance of that act.
Yeah, well, it's kind of layer upon layer, isn't it? Are there any questions? Are there any questions? No. And the questions that I started to learn about, that Gianfranco and Luigi and the rest of the Milan team were asking, was kind of my first introduction to family therapy. And my first introduction to those questions was kind of spellbinding. I was on the receiving end of a supervision meeting with a psychiatrist, a friend of ours called Robin Rutledge. And I went there to talk to him about a situation that I was really kind of intimidated by. It was a young man abusing children. And so he asked me a whole bunch of questions about the situation that kind of left me hypnotized. I'd not heard questions like that before, but got me really intrigued. And I went back and started talking to him, and one thing led to another. And it's, 35 or 40 years later that we're friends and still talking about questions. But they were questions that were, they stimulated curiosity. They created some sense, asking something that was unusual, you hadn't thought of before. And I think that was part of the artistry, to ask questions that were introduced, what they would then call news of difference. So not the normal questions that people would be asked necessarily, but not only about, for example, what did your friends say, but who noticed what your friend said, and what did they do then? And so there was a level of depth and bringing in social interaction and the relationships of people around things that were not necessarily the normal way of thinking. And I could not have put words to it, as I try to now, about what was so intriguing, but it was just something that sort of caught my interest. So I like that notion of introducing news of difference through questions. And I think for me, that's one of the things that I love most about solution-focused therapy, is that there are so many ways in which that happens.
Mm-hmm. So, Ian, what drew you to solution-focused or solution-focused brief therapies?
I was fond of wandering around the University of New South Wales library in the early 80s, and I accidentally borrowed a book by Jay Haley called Ordeal Therapy, which was introduced me to the work of Milton Erickson. And that was way before I was a psychologist. I didn't become a psychologist for 15 years after that. Mm-hmm. But I was working, with people at sort of in the pointy end of the child protection system, up on the streets in King's Cross, mm-hmm. and before that in youth refuges, and then in doing some work in disabilities. But I guess I was always interested in how to be useful for people, and that a strong emphasis on what was practical. So, theories about people, and a lot of the, poisoning rats in psychology labs and writing reports, what didn't really do it for me. I was more interested in sociology, anthropology, understanding people in context, and I think that interest in what was practical and how to be helpful meant that when I chose a postgraduate course and saw that it was in solution-focused therapy and read a bit about it, I thought, well, this is a great fit for me, and indeed it was. I took to it like a duck to water. And in my first year of studying that, which I was in '97, I came across Allan's first paper as well, and then of course that set me on a path to thinking more about context. But the two together have been very influential in my way of working in a practical and focused way in a conversation, and trying not to get caught up in my own expert knowledge. Like we like all of the constructivist therapies, we take a not knowing stance, which is about if you take that seriously, it's about trying to bracket out what you think might be helpful and listen very, very carefully to what the person is saying, and with listening with that constructive ear to try to form your next question. And I think what the solution-focused sort of process brings is some sort of punctuation, if you like, or structure to a session, which can be helpful. Otherwise you can kind of wander a bit. Nothing wrong with wandering a bit, but if you want to work efficiently, a little bit of a structure is quite helpful. I think it doesn't have to be an imposition, but it's a backbone, and if you get a little lost, you can come back to it, back to the structure. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, questions. It's interesting how, I suppose through the constructive therapies or that notion and other ways, they were explaining how questions are not just means of obtaining information, they're ways of introducing and creating information. Because when you ask a question, inevitably, you introduce some sort of notion or presupposition or idea to the person that you're talking with, and you ask them then to comment upon or reflect upon or provide information related to the presupposition that you've introduced them to. And it connects also to power for me in an interesting way, because the who gets to ask the questions is tied to all kinds of social conventions about your role. Are you a therapist or a child protection worker or a police officer or whatever your position is? But in our roles as therapists, we are typically accorded the opportunity to ask most of the questions, which is an opportunity to exercise influence. It isn't just that we're asking to find things out, it's that we're asking in order to help a person experience some sort of meaningful change in their life, the change that they themselves have selected as meaningful.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
And so that process of understanding that questions are formative, they're constructive, they introduce things. In order to really appreciate that, I think you have to accept that, working as a therapist, you have a certain position of power, influence, that you're trying to exercise as gently as you possibly can and as usefully as you possibly can by asking, in the best cases, simple, direct, meaningful questions tied to the context of the person you're meeting with. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, it's not always easy to do. I used to sometimes listen to podcasts on other therapy approaches just out of interest, but I would find that, and I stopped doing it because I found that what would happen is I go into a conversation with somebody, and my head would be swimming with all these ideas, and they weren't helpful. It was actually distracting me from listening carefully to what was happening in front of me and what the person was hoping for. I was thinking about all these ideas I'd heard about different therapies and different ideas about change and about people and attachment, and it really was very unhelpful. So it did come right back to paying attention to what's happening in the interaction, what people tell me they're hoping for, why that's important, why it's realistic, if you like, that they're hoping for that. Yeah, and ask those questions that build on what the person says they're wanting, and build on what the person identifies as being important and already, working a little in their lives, or present a little in their lives. Because obviously that's the most efficient way to proceed. I mean, trying to teach, to pretend that you're an expert in somebody else's life, and then trying to teach them a model about how they should go about making their lives better. I mean, it's not just the height of arrogance. It's taking a position of power to potentially an abusive place.
Yeah.
It's fascism.
Yeah.
So, Allan, if I were to, as an example, ask you, how would you know if one of your questions was really successful, and what difference would it make to you to see someone doing so much better? What do you think of that question?
Yeah, I've been listening very carefully to your questions, Catherine. They're lovely. But what do you notice? I suppose it depends on the moment, doesn't it? If there is a question or a way of interacting that the question is part of, I think, if I can put it that way, because it's not all about the questions. It's about your whole manner of interacting with somebody. It's about where you meet and why. It's about how you present yourself and who you are. And there's so much to it that sets up a context in which a question can be asked in a kind of a genuine, direct manner that allows a person to choose to be possibly more forthright or more direct about the suffering they've been experiencing, or more open about somebody doing something horrible to them, or more directly in touch with their hopes and aspirations, because they might not have been asked those questions before. So, and I think when that happens, I don't know, I feel a sort of something in the interaction. I'm not sure exactly what terms to put to it, but there's a kind of a settledness, if I can put it that way. There's a kind of a connection that you experience. We all know what I mean by that, I think, but I don't have quite the right terms. And then you can see that a person takes something up in earnest and is really trying to find a way to give meaning and find a way to talk about it. And often, I mean, and that can be a fairly somber tone. It can be but it can also be a very playful tone. And I think so sometimes for me, and it could be just a dysfunctional response to my, upbringing. I don't know, but I find when you're able to find a place that you can ask questions that allow you to be somewhat playful with people, even when people are experiencing quite a lot of distress and concern, there is a certain form of respect or playfulness and safety that can convey. So I think it's about finding the right way in the right moment, which if you're really listening and you don't have, as Ian's saying, if you don't have so many theories in your head about where you need to go, but you're trying to learn what's important to people, you're more likely to happen upon that kind of moment.
Thank you. So, Ian, can you deconstruct the kind of embedded presuppositions that I was trying to convey in that kind of question? Really, I'm just copying the kind of questions Allan asks, like the how will you know, and
yeah. Well, I mean, the question, how will you know, of course, presupposes that somebody knows. Direct compliment, very indirect, mind you, but that's the best way to compliment people, is to for it to come naturally from the the turn-taking process that is a conversation, not imposed as something you have to do but really embedded in the way the conversation unfolds. So if we ask a question, how did you know to do that, or how did you know that was the best thing to do, we're really conveying to the person that our belief that they do know, or they might have chosen the best thing. And people will, of course, correct you if in the latter case, how did you know that was the best thing to do? People will sometimes say, well, I didn't. And then give you some other information, which of course then becomes basis for the next question. But I think generally speaking, in most of the constructivist sorts of therapies, there is the idea that people are experts in their own life, and they build often on the work of Milton Erickson, who said there's nothing wrong with you, that's what's right with you can't fix. So this idea that there is always something there to utilize. We don't bring abstractions and theories into our work. We pay close attention to what people are saying and doing, and we tend to be focused more on the present and the future than on the past. But the past is a source of information about values and skills and competencies that can be brought into the present for the purposes of helping the person realizing their hopes and aspirations. I think the solution focused kind of set of tools does that very nicely, although it's shared by quite a few therapies that are essentially different from more expert-driven therapies. Things like schema therapy. I know people who love it, but I look at some of those models, and I just think, oh my God, it's bewildering. There are so many things to try to hold in your head. How on earth do you do this? It's like working your way through a dictionary in a conversation. How could I possibly stay focused on what someone was telling me and listen carefully if I've got all of these different ideas in my mind? Obviously different things work for different people, but I can't imagine how that would actually be helpful. Given, well, not in the way I work at any rate.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point, because the questions, if I understand what you're saying, in the way that we try to use them, they also provide you with a means of unpacking assumptions, theories, models that have been imposed on people, or that people have taken up because they're part of the soup in which we live, to try to understand, come to terms with, explain their own experience. So if a person says, which I encounter quite regularly, if I ask, so, okay, when they came at you in that particularly nasty kind of way, do you remember, how did you respond in that moment? Now that introduces a whole bunch of presuppositions that you are a responding agent. Now, I would say responding subject. I don't like the word agent so much, or the term agency, because it's often used to denote almost a personality trait, a kind of personal capacity. So I prefer the term activity to agency. But in any case, if you're, how did you respond in that moment? Do you remember, what did you do? And then you'll hear occasionally things like, well, I just froze. So somebody's taking up the trauma-informed discourse that is now, we're all swimming in. And so, but then if you ask the question, then if you kind of agree, okay, sure, you just froze, yeah. And you just simply accept what the person said, and then ask, how did you do that? When you say you froze, what do you mean? What did you do? I think in a quite subtle and gentle way, you're upending or challenging the notion of freezing, meaning, an automatic brain reaction, because you're returning to positioning the person as an active, competent subject. What did you do? Meaning they did something. In other words, their brain didn't just happen to them. They did something. And then, of course, you often hear things like, well, I just made sure I didn't look at him because I thought he had a knife. Well, then now you have something much more complex than
and,
freezing.
and concrete as well. Of course, it's not just more complex, but it's actually real.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's absolutely an extremely important point, is that when we ask questions, and I think solution focused, a narrative to some extent, others, response-based practice, we try to focus on social interaction, key social interactions as much as possible. So the interview process becomes much more concrete, as Ian's saying. It's about things that actually took place, but it provides a way of sort of contesting in a gentle way assumptions, propositions that might have been imposed on the person when they've tried to, or they've met with other people, they've tried to sort of understand why they're feeling the way they are.
I remember you sharing, Allan, in the beginning when you started to get, I guess you could say, like response-based sparks or like realizations about things, that you were working with a number of different women who were experiencing violence, and you'd ask them the typical kinds of questions like, well, how did that make you feel, or what were you feeling at that moment, or whatever, and they'd want to tell you what they did, and they'd kind of like ignore your question and pretend that you'd asked a different question, and you started noticing people really, especially when they've been treated as if they were passive or they've been victim blamed, they want to tell you what they did. They can even be a bit proud of it. And I've even noticed that with children, they'd much rather talk about activity, you know. Do you remember that time, that period when you were just like taking that in?
Absolutely. And that was the time in which I first met and got to know Insoo and Steve a little bit. And, we had some discussions about this kind of thing, and I started to study solution focused questions a lot more as well. But yeah, for some reason, I think partly also studying microanalysis of face-to-face communication, started to pay closer attention to people's descriptions about what they did. What I had been trying to do at the time was sort of apply this narrative idea of externalizing effects and impacts. And then, and that was particularly in cases of violence, right? So, and then I began to see that if I was asking, how did that affect you? And how did that affect you? And what was the effect of that effect? And so on. That it sort of had me harping on a certain kind of direction, but then people would introduce information about, I might ask a question about how did that affect you, but they might answer the question as though I'd asked them, how did you respond? So how did that affect you? Well, I never cried again for 25 years. So, okay, is that an effect or a response? And so then I kind of started to try to figure out that if I want to learn more about why that's important to the person, I need to ask how they responded, not how they were affected. And that really made the process much more, I wouldn't say streamlined, I don't mean it that way at all, but more direct, more sensible,
On point.
Yeah, more on point, exactly.
Yeah.
So that distinction then became very important, asking questions about how people respond. And then there's a philosophical position that sort of or a social psychological worldview that comes out of that as well, which is that the ways in which we suffer are also responses to the world. They're socially situated responses of humans in a context to real events in their lives, not abstract essences planted in our heads, brains. And so that was both practically significant, but also, I think, significant in a larger way as well, which is to begin to see emotions and forms of suffering as situated, intelligent, capacious responses to horrible adversities. I mean, how would you expect a quote unquote normal, quote unquote healthy Palestinian parent to respond to the attacks on Palestinian children at the present moment in history? Would you not expect horror, terror, dread, fear? Would that not be an expression of love? The most normal, healthy thing you could possibly imagine. And so asking people about responses, I think, tends to sort of shift the direction in appreciating and honoring different forms of suffering as intelligible, normal, dignified responses to absolutely horrific events. And I think that is a sort of a direction that our whole field needs to move.
For sure. Allan, I just want to chime in here that one of the things that really drew me into this work was that notion that all those things happen that you mentioned because the person is orienting to their dignity and the dignity of others, and they are resisting humiliation or even annihilation. And that concept of dignity, it just holds everything together in terms of understanding. And whenever I am having a moment when I'm talking with someone and I'm not sure where to go, I just think about how humiliated they must be feeling in response to certain events. And it never goes wrong. People always have something to say about that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Did you want to reflect on that, Ian?
Yeah, well, I agree. I think it's enormously important. I mean, I think traditional psychological practice makes a big deal of shame, but to me, they've kind of got that wrong. It should be dignity, not shame. There's shame as the primary emotion. Hang on, what if we were to make dignity the primary emotion rather than shame? Wouldn't that be a more helpful thing to be talking about and talking about affronts to dignity? Right, make a lot more sense.
Mm-hmm.
I think the expert model in psychology is. I always love that quote that I heard from, or I don't know if it's yours, Allan, or somebody else's, but the idea that sometimes our psychological interventions are the metaphorical equivalent of giving appetite reduction programs to starving people of Africa. Instead of actually looking at what's really going on and how people's experience makes sense in their context, we assume that we know what they need and can somehow apply it in a universal way, regardless of context, which is completely contradictory to what we are as human beings, which is orientated to dignity and care and safety. So it's really quite bizarre. The other thing that I was thinking of, just to skip back a little bit, is when people talk about being triggered. My habit is to say, when you say triggered, can I ask what were you connecting to? Which actually came up in a seminar that we were doing, where one of the participants put it that way, and I thought, I really like that. That's coming back to kind of trying to understand what it meant to somebody rather than talking about some sort of autonomous brain process, and that often helps, to move people away from this, out of that object position and back into a subject position where their actions are meaningful or important to them in some way. So I find that quite a helpful idea as well, because it's very common that people talk about fight, flight, and freeze, or being triggered, or but like being a doormat. There's a whole lot of I guess tropes that are repeated in the media and in film, and part of the way that I think probably from psychodynamic sort of thinking, people understand themselves through these frames, but they're not necessarily very accurate. And it's important to pay attention to when they might come up and to try to be curious about what that means to somebody, or to go back to context and unpack what was really happening, rather than accepting the first thing that somebody says as the sort of endpoint of the conversation. In solution focused work, the guys, Evan and Harvey and Chris over in Brief at London, they like to ask what are your best hopes from coming? but that you'll often get answers like, I'll be pain free, or I'll get some strategies or something. But they're not really. Although that's an answer to the question, you have to unpack that a lot further, because really that's not a description of what might be different in somebody's life. Tomorrow, next week, next month, as a result of having a conversation. So you need to ask. So when you're pain free, what else will be different? Who might be noticing that things are different when you're not living with pain, or so when you've got the strategies that you're hoping for, how do you suppose that will make a difference? What would your mum or your kids notice? Those sorts of questions. So again, going back into context and really unpacking what something looks like in a concrete kind of way, rather than just letting something slide. Staying in that position of curiosity, I think, is really important in the way that we work. Yeah.
Context. And also when you're working with people who have committed violence, the same set of notions apply, but in a different way, of course. And so it's been kind of conventional for a long period of time to, I think, in an effort to accord sort of humanity and dignity to people who have acted wrongly and harmed others, to treat that behavior as though it was an effect or an impact of some kind of force or tension acting on the person. You didn't really mean it. You were drunk, or you were, whatever it was, you were angry, you didn't know any better, whatever it might be. So there's been a whole set of notions, but one of the beautiful things that Nick Todd has done, and others with Calgary, where Gillian Weaver Dunlop and so forth, is to really, to notice ask questions that bring forward these small instances of deliberation, control, and in that, skillful behavior, even in the midst of so-called blow-ups or explosions. And on the one hand, that sounds as though it could be very confronting, and in a certain kind of way it is. But in another way, it is preserving of the dignity of the person, in that you're acknowledging that even though they were harming another person, hitting another person, they were still exercising deliberation and control. And therefore, we know, and we can talk about the fact that, and acknowledge the fact that you have the capacity for deliberation and control. And that is a much better place to work with people from. And so the same set of notions, but in a different language and in a different way, applies to working with people who have harmed others.
That's a really good segue for a place that I wanted to go right now, which is to Ireland. And I'll read you something fun. But it says, using our stance of ambivalent dispositioning and ambiguous metaphoric talk, we went on to develop a form of questioning which we called questioning at the extremes. So the fifth province, Imelda, McCarthy, Nollaig, Byrne, and this idea that what they wrote was that sometimes people will subtly, not overtly, give you permission to explore something a little bit further. And it could be like a taboo subject. It could be somebody who's hurting other people, and you can't ask it directly, but you can ask around it so that they can take some responsibility and uphold their own dignity at the same time. And I remember one of these questions was sort of like, if the violence in your family doesn't stop, or if you don't refrain from hurting people, who will die first? That kind of like really jarring question. And so do you want to just comment a little bit about that? Because the contributions from Ireland were really important to address the serious issues of violence in the society, but also in the homes against wives and girlfriends, right?
This is me and Ian having an argument.
Oh, Well, I think you know more about the fifth province stuff than I do. I think I've only read a couple of papers from Imelda.
Mhm.
Yeah. But I think, didn't you invite them out?
Yeah, I got to know Imelda reasonably well, and Imelda and Nollaig came to Vancouver Island
Yep.
a couple of times, saw them in Vancouver, and they were, as you know, very connected in with the Milan team, Bosco and Chiquin in particular, but with the whole family therapy movement. And the first thing that really captured me around them was them talking about showing on a PowerPoint slide text and then showing comments in the margins. And they were really talking about resistance to colonialism. That's the language I would use, colonization. And I hadn't really understood or heard things in quite that way before. And that for me was, okay, I'm right there with these guys. I really like that. um, and then the way that they ask questions to, oh gosh, um, to be in a certain sense direct about things that you're not supposed to be direct about.
Mhm.
Um, I really appreciate that a great deal. And actually, I think a lot of people, if you're asked a question like that in a skillful way, so, what do you think is going to happen to your kids, really? Who do you think will be the first to die if you continue to violate your wife? Like, to really introduce that set of suppositions to somebody, this is, you're really harming your children, you're damaging your children. But to formulate all of that in such a question, I think it's pretty gutsy practice. Um, but and I guess I understand that partly in the context of colonized Ireland and the whole all the prescription about not being direct about it, all the lies, duress. I mean, you can appreciate and understand the desire to be simply direct about the harmfulness of abusive, violent behavior. So I think with that, they kind of blew the lid off in a certain really useful way with that paper for me.
Mhm. Yeah, they were gutsy, like courageous,
Yeah,
also graceful and skillful,
yeah,
and
yeah,
had a lot of sensitivity, and worked with that metaphor that in this space that we're creating in this fifth province, we can
yeah,
talk openly and safely. This is where
yeah.
the chieftains meet, and we can have these hard or risky conversations
Mhm.
because we can handle it, sort of that kind of aura about it.
I really like that you brought their work into our conversation, Cathy.
Yeah,
What were you what was your thought process in that? What were you thinking about in
yeah. So what I was reading today was that kind of I don't know, it's a kind of finesse, and it's
yeah.
about dignity. Another example, and I'll put a content warning on this video, was knowing that in this family, the father had been sexually violating the daughter, and he wouldn't admit it. But he did say, my wife is very forgiving. And they said, oh, yeah, tell me about that. And he said, there's probably nothing that she wouldn't forgive me for. So then the therapist said, so if you were to get your daughter pregnant, you think your wife would forgive you for that? And he said, yes, I think she would forgive me. So it was a delicate way that he could admit that he was committing this violence, um, but almost like a quiet negotiation.
Mhm,
They didn't corner him, if you know what I mean.
mhm.
Like he could have just blown up the conversation, but he agreed to go there in that way by
Yeah.
saying, I could probably do anything and she would forgive me. And so I just thought there's a kind of, I don't know, delicatesse or finesse and that kind of very
Yeah.
careful traveling together with people.
I think you need really good supervision to practice in that kind of way as well.
Mm-hmm.
You know, to have colleagues that you can talk to about this, and about, well, we all need that anyway, but about how you go about that kind of delicate negotiation, because for me at least, it's all too easy to feel like you just want to get up and sort of leave the room or punch somebody in the face.
Mm.
You know, when you hear about behavior like that, and so, you know, you feel that kind of coming on, or however you might be feeling in that moment, but to
Mhm.
have the sort of wherewithal and the composure and the thoughtfulness
Mhm.
to ask good questions like that in those moments, that's really that's beautiful. It's so important in our work.
Yeah, and I think it's really
I wanted to,
sorry.
sorry, I wanted to introduce just a couple of other things. I'm not sure how much time we have, but
Yeah, go ahead.
one of the things that I do a lot, and I'm not sure if you guys do this, I begin questions often by asking permission.
Mm-hmm.
Would it be okay if I'd like to know a bit more about X? Would that be all right? You know, sort of it's a kind of a it's a way of saying, I suppose, this is sort of sensitive. I'm hoping we can talk about that. You can say no about that. It is a real question. It isn't just a lead in to me asking anyway.
Yeah.
So I don't know about you guys, but I use those kind of questions quite a lot. I find them, I don't know what it is. If you ask those questions in a slow, kind of methodical, paced kind of way, I find they tend to create what seems to me to be quite a bit of safety.
Yeah, I agree. I think you're signaling respect for the person, and that you know, the conversation's collaborative. You know, you're not going to hijack it and just go where you want to go unless the person wants to kind of go there. Sometimes it's hard to do because, you know, we get well, I think I'm getting better at not doing it, but, you know, sometimes you want to push a particular barrow.
Yeah.
And you just got to make sure that you recognize you're starting to push your barrow and drop it. Like, hang on, this is not an opportunity for me to tell you something that I think is important. I've got to stay really focused on what the person's saying and what they're hoping to get from the conversation, and what might be helpful within that context.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, not drop into you know, little pearls of wisdoms and stories. Yeah.
You have to be an elder for that. Well, it brings us to the fly on the wall question, right? Because I often ask that at the beginning of a interview or a role play, especially if it's in front of other people. Say, you know, if I was a fly on the wall and you were starting to get really uncomfortable with where I was going here, or with some of the questions I was asking you, how would I know by your face that this wasn't fun anymore? And then sometimes they'll make the face like, or they'll say, I would just look at the floor, or I probably just would stop answering you. But that fly on the wall question, that comes from somewhere. Do you want to talk about that? Systemic?
For me, it was a way of getting more into social interaction. So if I was a fly on the wall, I mean, and I'm a fly, I can't read your mind, but I'm there when he's pointing the gun at you. If I'm a fly on the wall, how do I know that you're terrified? How do I know that you weren't just going to let him take your wallet? How would I have, what would I have seen that would have told me what you were going through? So it's a way of getting into those micro analytic details because often people, as Ian was mentioning, speak in generalities or abstractions.
Yeah.
About events, but it's there. I think probably if we were to think about it this way, we probably have all developed certain favorite questions for getting into interactional detail. Because I think we tend to go there a lot, because so much lives there.
Yeah, those third person perspective kind of questions too. I mean, the fly on the wall, it's good because it's not a person. It's like if someone says they've got a dog, why? Yeah, well, how does the dog respond when that happens? What if the dog could speak? What would he or she say? But
Yeah.
certainly, asking somebody like, "What would your mother notice?" or "What would your kids notice?" They're powerful questions, and they invite somebody to see their own interaction or actions through somebody else's eyes. And of course, when they're doing that, they're not doing it in an abstract way. They're doing it in a particular context. So you can ask for a concrete description. So tomorrow morning you get up and things are a little better in the way you've just been describing. Could you tell me, what would your little girl notice about you that would let her know that things were better or different in the way that you're talking about? So you're right back into an actual concrete. Well, it might be a hypothetical, but it's based on the person's putting themselves in their child's through seeing things through the child's eyes. In the kitchen in the morning, or going into the bedroom to wake them up and talking in a concrete way about what's different when they're different. And you don't get that detail if you don't. Well, you might get it, but it's easier for people to get it when they're describing it through the third person. You get a richer, more detailed description, I think, often.
Yeah. So your daughter might think that she might notice that you're a little perkier, you're a little bit more bubbly. Wow. What difference do you suppose that might make to her? Like at school, for example. And then I love those questions. They really, yeah. How do we make, just thinking if in terms of my own practice, I think I'm more likely to ask those questions a little bit later in interviews. But I have the feeling from a solution focused point of view, they might come earlier. I'm not sure.
Yeah. It depends on the conversation, right? So you're following the client's lead. I think sometimes, for me, what happens in my practice is that people might start talking about more concrete or day-to-day things, or things that are kind of problematic in some ways that we're then turning into, rather than problem solving, turning into kind of solution building. What is it you're hoping for instead? What would that look like? And often it's after, you've created a bit of a platform by helping people to describe their values and their skills and their competencies. It's at that point that people might then talk a little more about, the fact that, they've been suicidal, or that their partner's been violent toward them. But it's probably just the nature of my referrals, I think. Yeah. But as I think we'd all agree, every conversation is different, and if you have a script in your head about where it's going to go, it's probably not going to go very well. It really is about being following the client's or the person's lead, and listening with that constructive ear, and taking notes. So if there's things that you think you might want to come back to, or themes that you pick up, if the person's speaking in abstractions or something, it may not be the time right then at that point in the conversation to say something about that, but you might make a note of it and then listen for the time it comes up, only because you don't want to hijack the conversation and take it somewhere else for the point of gently challenging somebody. When to gently challenge somebody, or when to invite what might be a more fully accurate description is is going to be different in every single conversation. It depends on your relationship and the flow of the conversation. Yeah,
absolutely.
So depending on what kind of work we're doing, I might introduce a scaling question. If I ask someone, well, how was your morning been? And like, if you were to rate that sort of like between 0 and 10, and 10 was a fabulous morning, they would say, oh, it was about a 6. So that I might say, well, what could have made it a 7? And I might ask that quite early on, and they might say, if someone had brought me a lovely cup of coffee, and then do that kind of scaling or laddering. But I want to read something to both of you and get your take on it. A little exercise here. So I was doing some homework, and I wanted to read you a quote from an article by Sarah Smock Jordan, Adam Forer, and Janet Bavelis. And so they said that they were looking at tapes of counselors who use CBT and solution-focused brief therapy. They said, we tested whether expert practice reflects these differences in the models. A reliable microanalysis revealed that demonstration sessions by 3 experts in each model differed significantly in expected directions. For example, negative content was significantly higher in the CBT sessions because they were focused more on problem solving, whereas positive content was significantly higher in the solution focused because it focused on solution building. So basically they're surmising that through their microanalysis, people talked more negatively and felt actually more negative after a CBT session than after a solution focused session. What do you make of that?
Well, no big surprise to me. Yeah, I mean, I think again, the assumptions are quite different. The primary assumptions between a cognitive behavioral approach and a solution focused approach. And solution focused, where the assumptions are about largely about the process of having a conversation, but the assumptions about people are that they're already competent, they're already skillful, they already have the answers that they need. Whereas in cognitive behavioral therapy, it's more about the psychologist or the counselor is the expert, and they're more likely to, and that at heart still there's something wrong with the way you're thinking. We need to do some cognitive restructuring so you can be liberated. So it's not actually listening to the person about their experience and their expertise and their ideas about what's working and where they want to go. It's proceeding along the lines of a kind of expert model of what somebody needs before you right from the get-go. And that makes a difference in how you listen and how you frame the questions. So you're shining a light, like if therapy is shining lights in darker spaces or in spaces where people are trying to find their way, the light you're shining in a CBT kind of conversation is pointing in quite a different direction to that that's been shown in a solution focused style of conversation. I think I mentioned I like the idea that I couldn't remember what it was, but that the Shazer talks about. I think I said progressive, regressive, and digressive narratives, but I think it's progressive stability and regressive narratives. So there's the idea that some conversations move forward in the way that the person hopes for. Some just don't go anywhere. There's a stability narrative. It doesn't really move either way, and others tend to take the person down into problems and deficits. And I think the evidence from the microanalysis studies tend to suggest that CBT does more of the latter than the former.
Takes you down always.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think where in terms of response-based practice, I think where maybe we started to differ a little bit with some solution-focused practitioners or ideas about solution-focused therapy was the idea that you wouldn't really talk about problems. And but because we were working mostly in cases of violence, violence is a particular kind of problem. And often people do want to have the experience of talking about what happened or part of what happened in a way. So in a certain kind of way, they're talking about a problem. But the whole notion that you can talk about the problem in a way that enhances the dignity of the person and in a way that positions the person as an active, competent subject, I think that's what can I say? I'm not sure what to call that, but I think that's we don't.
Well, I think it's shared, isn't it? I think that's they've been one of the things with solution focused therapy is it doesn't make any judgments, but of course it's not claiming to be an answer to everything, right? And I think the guys from Brief kind of say, look, having conversations about safety is necessary, but it's not really part of the solution focused model.
Yeah.
Because that's not really what solution focused is about. So you move outside the model to ask a different set of questions. Yeah. But you can still do that in a way that share some of these assumptions about dignity and people having expertise in their own lives and needing to follow people's leads, and recognizing the importance of safety and care and underlying values and competencies. And I think I would agree that response-based practice is quite different in the way it approaches violence as a problem. But I think a lot of the kind of assumptions, if you go back like to Erikson or constructivist sort of ideas are very similar. Yeah, I think they sit quite nicely together. Not that they're the same, but
no, they absolutely do. Yeah. And I agree. And the certain kinds of from practices that were developed, questions that were developed without an explicit focus on social justice and interpersonal violence as unique kinds of personal experiences and unique kinds of quote unquote problems. I think so. For example, the Milan team, hypothesizing circularity neutrality. Well, you pretty much have to suspend circularity and neutrality as principles for practice if you're going to work in cases of violence. And so I think what we're hoping for is that, as in solution focus, where we just find kind of, we're part of the same family, same different branch, same tree.
Yeah.
But that's not so true with, say, trauma-informed practice or cognitive behavioral therapy or object relations therapy or attachment theory related therapies. Different trees, not same tree, different branches. So there's a set of assumptions that I think are not necessarily that well spelled out. But I think partly that's what we're trying to talk about now. And Ian's trying to talk the assumption of competency, the assumption of activity, the assumption that a person would have responded competently to whatever problem, including violence, even though they couldn't stop it, they would have done what they could. These are all very closely shared assumptions. I think they come from common roots. Mm-hmm. And if we're kind of practicing in those kinds of ways, I think we're sharing much more than is different.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, this seems like a natural place to wind down. Before we leave each other,
yes, Cathy. Yes, I'd like to ask you: is there anything you would have liked to ask us about that that you haven't? That might be helpful for either another day or another time.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's so much to talk about. I think another conversation could be cross-cultural applications with a sort of post-colonial or anti-colonial frame. I really appreciate solution-focused questions, and they've been so helpful to me and to a lot of people around me. And yet I really know that, like, Indigenous folks, especially Indigenous women and maybe Two-Spirit folks, they really want to talk about colonial violence. Yeah, so we can use these questions, but there's a different cultural frame, especially for people who have been targeted all their life. And those, I don't know what you call them, skills of survivance, and resistance, and caring for your loved ones under siege, those kinds of things. There's a lot we could talk about there, and it's a conversation for another time, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks, Cathy. Thanks, Ian.
Yeah.
Nice to see you
Great to
guys.
see you both, and thank you so much. I hope you
Good
have
to
a
see you.
great morning and evening.
Thanks, Cathy.
Bye.
Thanks.
Bye
Yep,
for now.
bye, guys.